Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. My Uncle Greg owned a substantial piece of land near a place called Fairbridge Hollow, right where civilization surrenders to the sprawling wilderness of Bear Mill State Forest. The property had been in our family for generations, though nobody had done much with it beyond occasional hunting trips and summer camping excursions. That winter, Uncle Greg decided it was time to clear out some of the overgrown sections and make the old cabin habitable again. He asked if I wanted to help. At the time, I was 22, fresh out of my first semester of grad school, and desperately in need of a break from academic pressure and city noise. The idea of spending a long weekend alone in the quiet woods sounded like exactly what I needed, almost therapeutic. A chance to work with my hands, breathe clean air, and maybe gain some perspective on what direction my life should take. So I agreed. I loaded up my truck with supplies. A week's worth of canned goods, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, work gloves, a toolbox, and the old pump-action shotgun Uncle Greg insisted I bring. Just in case, he'd said with that knowing look rural folk give city dwellers. At the time, I thought he meant for raccoons, or maybe a curious black bear. Looking back, I wonder if he knew something I didn't. The drive out took nearly 3 hours. The main highway eventually gave way to county roads, which then dissolved into narrow gravel paths that snaked through the hills like arteries through aging flesh. Everything was covered in a thick blanket of December snow, the kind that muffles sound and makes the world feel smaller, more isolated. The trees, mostly bare oaks and skeletal pines, stood like silent sentinels on either side of the road, their branches reaching across the path as if trying to prevent my passage. When I finally arrived at the cabin, twilight was already settling over the forest. The structure looked exactly as I remembered it from childhood visits. Small, weather-beaten, slightly crooked, like it had been built by someone who cared more about function than form. The wood siding had faded to a silvery gray, and the single window facing the front was so dirty it looked opaque. A small porch sagged under the weight of accumulated snow and time. The inside wasn't much better. Dust covered every surface. Cobwebs draped the corners like macabre decorations, and the air smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. But it was structurally sound, and that's what mattered. I spent the first few hours making the place livable, sweeping out debris, taping up the gaps around the windows with duct tape to keep the cold at bay, and coaxing the ancient propane heater back to life. By the time I finished, darkness had fallen completely, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. That first night passed without incident. I made a simple dinner of canned chili heated over the propane stove, then settled onto my cot with a battered paperback Western novel I'd found wedged between the floorboards. The cabin creaked and groaned as the temperature continued to fall, the normal sounds of wood contracting in the cold, but it didn't bother me. I'd grown up around old buildings. I understood their language. Outside, the wind dragged across the trees with a low, mournful sound that reminded me of breath moving through a massive set of lungs. But that too seemed natural, even peaceful in its way. I eventually drifted off to sleep, warm in my sleeping bag, feeling satisfied with the day's work. The second night, everything changed. It was around 10 o'clock. I was sitting on the cot, reading by the light of a battery-powered lantern, when I heard them. 3 distinct crunches in the snow directly behind the cabin, not the random cracking of ice or the soft whoosh of snow sliding off branches. These were footsteps, deliberate, measured, heavy. Human footsteps. I froze, the book forgotten in my hands. My first instinct was to rationalize. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost and was looking for shelter. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't make sense. It was 10 o'clock at night in December, miles from any marked trail. Who would be hiking out here in these conditions? The footsteps came again. Closer this time, a single, careful crunch, followed by absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional, like whoever or whatever was out there was listening just as intently as I was. My heart began hammering against my ribcage. I slowly, quietly, reached over and turned off the lantern. Darkness swallowed the cabin interior immediately. I sat there in the black, barely breathing, every sense straining to pick up another sound. Nothing. 1 minute passed, then 2. Just when I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, another footstep echoed through the night, so close to the cabin wall I could have sworn I felt the vibration through the floorboards. That's when training kicked in. I reached down beside the cot and grabbed the shotgun, my hands moving with a sureness I didn't actually feel. The cold metal was reassuring in my grip. I pumped it once, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the small space, and waited. Part of me wanted to call out, to demand that whoever was out there identify themselves, but some deeper instinct warned me against it. Something about those footsteps felt wrong. The spacing was too deliberate, the silence between steps too calculated. This wasn't someone lost or confused. This was something stalking. I crept across the cabin floor, wincing at every creak of the old boards, and positioned myself beside the back window. It was boarded over, but there were gaps between the slats. I pressed my face close and peered out into the night. At first, I saw nothing but darkness and snow. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, offering almost no light. But gradually, my eyes adjusted, and I could make out the vague shapes of trees, the slight variations in the snow's surface. No person, no animal, nothing. I stayed at that window for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes. My legs cramped, my neck ached from the awkward angle, but I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion and cold forced me back to the cot. I sat there, shotgun across my lap, and somehow, impossibly, dozed off sometime after midnight. When I woke to pale morning light filtering through the dirty window, my first thought was that I'd had a nightmare. The cabin looked peaceful in the daylight, shabby and cold, but not threatening. I almost laughed at my paranoia from the night before. Then I stepped outside. The boot prints were immediately visible in the fresh snow that had fallen overnight, a thin dusting that had settled over everything like a blank canvas, making the marks stand out in sharp relief. They weren't mine. I'd only gone out the front door since arriving, and these prints were in the back, exactly where I'd heard the footsteps. They were larger than my boots, with a longer stride, and they told a story that made my blood run cold. Someone had circled the cabin, not once, but twice. The prints formed 2 complete loops around the structure, always maintaining the same careful distance, maybe 10 feet from the walls. It was the kind of pattern a predator makes when surveying its territory, or a hunter examining a trap before deciding how to spring it. But here's what made my hands shake as I followed those tracks. They stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off toward the woods or back toward any trail. They just ended. Mid-step, mid-stride, pointed directly at the tree line as if whoever made them had simply been lifted straight up into the air and carried away. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that final print, trying to find a rational explanation. Maybe wind had covered the rest, but the snow was undisturbed all around. Maybe I was looking at it wrong, but I circled that spot 3 times, and the conclusion never changed. The tracks stopped. I actually laughed, a short, nervous bark of sound that seemed absurd in the silent woods. It was the kind of laugh that comes when your brain is trying to reject what your eyes are showing you. That laugh died in my throat when I noticed something else. A second set of prints, smaller and less distinct. that seemed to approach from a different angle before merging with the first set. It looked like two people had been out here, walking together, before one of them simply vanished. I packed up immediately. My original plan had been to stay another night, finish clearing the brush around the cabin, maybe get some actual work done. But every cell in my body was screaming at me to leave. I threw my gear into my backpack with shaking hands, not bothering to fold anything properly, and headed for my truck. The key wouldn't turn. I tried again, pumping the gas pedal like that might help. Nothing. The engine didn't crank, didn't click, didn't make any sound at all. It was as if someone had reached in and disconnected the battery, or worse, as if the truck itself had decided it didn't want to leave. But that was impossible. The truck had been fine yesterday. The radio had worked. The headlights had come on without issue when I'd checked them the previous evening. I popped the hood with trembling fingers and stared at the engine. I'm not a mechanic, but I know enough to spot obvious problems. A disconnected cable, a corroded terminal, something. But everything looked normal. Connected. Intact. Fuck, I whispered to the cold air. The word fogged in front of my face and dissipated. The nearest gas station was about 5 miles down the old forest road. I'd hiked it before with Uncle Greg during better weather. It would be a long walk in December, but manageable. I grabbed my pack, zipped my jacket all the way up, and started walking. The snow had begun falling harder now. Big fat flakes that stuck to my eyelashes and made it difficult to see more than 20 yards ahead. The road, barely more than a rutted track through the forest, became harder to follow as fresh snow filled in the tire marks and footprints from previous travelers. After about an hour of walking, my legs burning from the effort of pushing through increasingly deep snow, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. Fresh boot prints on the trail ahead of me. Not mine. These were smaller, with a shorter stride, and they were heading in the same direction I was, as if someone was walking just ahead of me, following the same path toward civilization. But I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, and in this snow with visibility this poor, I should have spotted them easily. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded thin and weak, absorbed by the falling snow. "Is someone there?" No answer, just the soft whisper of snowflakes landing on the frozen ground. I kept walking, but faster now. My eyes locked on those prints. They were so fresh that snow hadn't even begun to fill them in. Whoever made them couldn't be more than a few minutes ahead. 10 minutes later, I looked down and felt my stomach drop. There were 2 sets of prints now, both smaller than mine. Both walking side by side, stride perfectly matched, heading in my direction. Both had started mid-trail, with no indication of where they'd come from. It was as if 2 people had simply materialized on the path behind me and started following. I spun around, scanning the white curtain of falling snow behind me. "Who's there? I can see your tracks." Silence. The trees loomed on either side of the trail, dark and still. Nothing moved except the endless snow. My heart was racing now, adrenaline flooding my system. Every horror story I'd ever heard, every warning about the deep woods, came rushing back. Don't go alone. Always tell someone where you're going. Never hike after dark. I started running. My backpack bounced painfully against my spine with each step. My boots slipped on hidden ice beneath the snow. My lungs burned as I sucked in freezing air. But I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind me, I swear to God, I could hear footsteps matching my pace. Light, quick footsteps that somehow stayed exactly the same distance behind me no matter how fast I ran. The trail forked ahead. Left led downhill toward the main road and eventually the gas station. Right climbed steeply upward toward an old fire tower I remembered from childhood visits with Uncle Greg. The tower had been abandoned for years, probably unsafe, but it was shelter and it was high ground. Some instinct I can't explain made me go right. The climb was brutal. My thighs screamed in protest. My lungs felt like they were being shredded from the inside. I slipped twice on ice-covered roots, catching myself on tree branches that scraped my hands raw even through my gloves. Behind me, those footsteps continued. Never closer, never farther. Just there. When I finally reached the base of the fire tower, I didn't pause to catch my breath. The stairs were a nightmare of rotted wood and missing steps, covered in a treacherous layer of ice. I had to grip the rusted railing with both hands, pulling myself upward, testing each step before trusting it with my full weight. Halfway up, I slipped. My elbow cracked against the edge of a step so hard, I saw stars. The pain was excruciating, radiating up my arm and into my shoulder. For a moment, I thought I might pass out and tumble all the way back down. But fear is a powerful motivator. I kept climbing. The hatch at the top was stuck, sealed by rust and ice. I braced my shoulder against it and shoved with everything I had. It gave way suddenly, sending me sprawling onto the floor of the tower's observation room. It was exactly as abandoned as I'd expected. Broken glass from the window scattered across the floor, graffiti covering the walls, a sour smell of decay and animal droppings thick in the air. One of the window boards had partially fallen away, offering a narrow view of the trail below. I crawled to that gap and looked down, trying to control my breathing, which was coming in harsh gasps that clouded the frigid air. At first, I saw nothing but snow and trees. Then, just before the sun began its final descent toward the horizon, they appeared. 3 figures in dark clothing, no flashlights, no visible breath clouds despite the cold. They moved in complete silence, gliding across the snow without leaving tracks, or at least none that I could see from this distance. The first figure stopped at the base of the hill directly below the tower. The other 2 continued forward until they stood beside the first, forming a small semicircle. Then they all turned to face upward, directly toward my position. They didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, 3 motionless figures staring up at me. I pulled back from the window, my heart trying to escape through my throat. I retreated to the far corner of the observation room, wedging myself behind an old filing cabinet that had been left behind, and pulled a moldy tarp over my body like a child hiding from monsters under a blanket. Hours passed in that cramped, uncomfortable position. Every few minutes, I'd force myself to crawl back to the window and check. Sometimes the figures were gone. Sometimes all 3 were still there. Sometimes only 1 or 2, but in different positions, closer or farther away, but never climbing the hill, never calling out, just waiting, watching. When dawn finally broke, washing the forest in weak gray light, I checked one final time. The trail below was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of tracks entirely. The snow lay smooth and undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. As if I'd imagined everything, but I knew I hadn't. I climbed down from that tower on legs that shook so badly I had to stop every few steps to prevent myself from falling. When I finally reached the bottom, I ran. No strategy, no planning, just pure animal instinct driving me toward the road, toward people, toward safety. A salt truck found me about a mile from the gas station. The driver, an older man with kind eyes, took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. He just wrapped me in a blanket that smelled of diesel and coffee, called the sheriff on his CB radio, and drove me back toward civilization. The sheriff met us at the cabin. 2 deputies accompanied him. They walked the perimeter, took photos, wrote things in notepads. When they asked me to show them the boot prints, we found nothing but smooth, undisturbed snow. The tracks had vanished completely, as if the forest had erased all evidence of what I'd witnessed. The sheriff asked if I'd been drinking. His tone wasn't accusatory, just weary, the voice of a man who'd heard too many strange stories from too many frightened people and learned not to believe any of them. I told him no. Told him everything I'd seen, the footsteps, the circling tracks, the figures on the trail. He nodded slowly, wrote something down, and didn't write anything else. They jump-started my truck. It fired up on the first try as if it had never been dead at all. Uncle Greg sold the property that spring. When I asked him why, he just said he was done with fixer-uppers, too old for that kind of work. But I noticed he never mentioned the cabin again, never suggested we go back for one more hunting trip. Never even drove past that turnoff when we were in the area. The guy who bought the land came out once, according to the county records. He boarded up all the windows, reinforced the door, and left within a week. The property has been empty ever since. Sometimes I wonder who or what walks those woods now. What circles that cabin at night looking for something that's no longer there? And I wonder if it's still waiting, patient and silent, for someone else to accept an invitation to spend a quiet weekend alone in the wilderness. I've never gone back, and I never will. The trail wasn't particularly challenging, just under 3 miles from start to summit, but it was steep enough that coming down in the dark required careful attention. My cousin Ray had gone off for the week to help a neighbor with some heavy labor, cutting and hauling firewood to sell before winter set in completely. She'd asked if I'd stay at her place to feed her dogs and keep the pipes from freezing. I'd agreed without hesitation. Ray's house was quiet, isolated, and exactly what I needed after a difficult few months. I'm not from that area originally. I grew up in a small town about 90 minutes south, close enough that the dialect and culture felt familiar, but far enough that I'd always been a visitor rather than a local. Still, I'd been to Ray's property enough times to know the woods around her place, the ridge trail. In particular, I'd hiked at least a dozen times over the years. It was a well-maintained path marked with blue blazes painted on trees at regular intervals. Nothing dangerous, nothing tricky. That afternoon, I decided to hike up to the ridge summit to try to get cell reception. Ray's house was in a dead zone where even the best providers couldn't penetrate the valley walls, and I needed to send a few messages, check in with work, that sort of thing. I figured I'd be up and back before it got properly dark, maybe an hour round trip at most. But I didn't account for how quickly the light dies in December. The sun doesn't set gradually that time of year, it just drops behind the ridge like someone turning off a switch. One moment you have decent visibility, and the next, you're walking through rapidly thickening shadows that make every tree root a potential ankle breaker. I made it to the top without issue and spent maybe 10 minutes attempting to coax my phone into finding a signal. I stood on the highest point, holding my phone over my head like some kind of desperate scarecrow, rotating in slow circles while squinting at the screen. Nothing. Not even a single flickering bar. Just the words, "No service," glowing mockingly in the darkness. I gave up with a muttered curse and started back down. The trail was rougher than I remembered, loose shale in places, narrow switchbacks where one wrong step could send you tumbling down a 20-foot drop. And the boots I was wearing, borrowed from Ray's mudroom because mine had gotten soaked earlier, had virtually zero tread left. Every step felt uncertain. So I took it slow. Flashlight out, watching each footfall, testing my weight before committing fully to each step. I was about halfway down when I saw him. At first, I thought it was a tree, just an oddly shaped trunk or a large stump I hadn't noticed on the way up. But then it moved. Just a slight shift, a subtle adjustment of weight, and I realized with a jolt of adrenaline that it was a person standing just off the trail, partially concealed behind a thick pine. He was maybe 10 feet away, close enough that I should have heard him approach, should have noticed him before now, but there had been no sound, no warning. He was just there, as if he'd been waiting. I raised the flashlight beam slightly, illuminating him. He stepped forward into the light, worn jeans, a long brown coat that hung past his knees, too heavy for the weather. Pale face, unremarkable features. But his eyes were what stopped me cold. He didn't blink when my flashlight hit them, didn't flinch or squint against the brightness, just stared directly into the beam like the light wasn't even there. "Hey," I said, trying to keep my voice casual, friendly. "You all right?" No response. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge the question. His face remained completely blank. Not hostile, not confused, just empty. "You lost or something?" I tried again, forcing a small laugh that came out strangled. Still nothing. No shift in expression. Not even the slight rise and fall of breath that you'd expect from someone standing in the cold. He was perfectly, unnaturally still. My instincts were screaming at me to move, to get away from this person, but the trail was narrow here. There wasn't room to turn around quickly without risking a fall, and something told me that showing my back to this man would be a terrible mistake. He took a step forward. I automatically stepped back, maintaining the distance between us, my grip tightening on the flashlight. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even an unfriendly smile. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes, that looks learned rather than felt. Like he was mimicking an expression he had seen but didn't fully understand. "You come up from the hollow." His voice was thin and scratchy, like vocal cords that hadn't been used in a long time. There was no particular accent, but something about the cadence felt wrong, like he was translating from another language inside his head before speaking. "Yeah," I answered, trying to keep my tone normal. "Unthreatening. Staying at Ray's, just heading back now." He nodded slowly, that empty smile never changing. "That's good. You want to keep going?" Yeah, I plan to." I attempted a laugh again. It sounded even worse this time. He took another step forward, casual, unhurried, and slipped his hand into his coat. Every muscle in my body tensed. My mind raced through possibilities. Knife, gun, some kind of weapon. Should I run? Could I outrun him on this terrain? Would yelling help or just alert his friends if he had any? But he didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out something else. A length of wire, or maybe cord. It was dark and thin, hanging loosely in his fingers like a dead snake. "You're going to hear something soon," he said matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "Might sound like it's behind you. Might sound like it's ahead." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "You don't stop." My throat had gone completely dry. I couldn't have responded if I'd wanted to. Then he added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "If you see another me, don't talk to it." His smile widened, stretching his face in a way that looked painful. "Don't look at it." Before I could process what he'd just said, he turned and walked directly into the trees. Not down the trail. Not back the way either of us had come. Just sideways, into the dense undergrowth and darkness, moving without hesitation as if he could see perfectly in the pitch black. Within seconds, he'd vanished completely. No sound of branches breaking, no rustling of leaves. Just gone. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, my mind trying desperately to understand what had just happened. Then survival instinct kicked in, and I started moving. Not running, not yet. But walking quickly, deliberately, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the trail ahead. At first, all I could hear was my own footsteps and the rapid hammer of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, gradually, I became aware of something else. A sound behind me. Not quite footsteps. More like something large moving through the underbrush, pushing aside branches and disturbing the layer of dead leaves that carpeted the forest floor, and it was matching my pace exactly. When I sped up, it sped up. When I slowed to navigate a tricky section of trail, it slowed too. He stopped abruptly and spun around, swinging my flashlight beam toward the sound. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the gentle movement of branches in the cold wind. But the moment I turned back around and started walking again, I heard it resume. Steady, persistent, exactly the same distance behind me. I picked up speed, my careful attention to the trail forgotten in favor of pure forward momentum. My borrowed boots slipped on icy patches. Low-hanging branches whipped at my face. I didn't care. I just needed to move faster than whatever was following. Then I heard it ahead of me, too. The same sound, that deliberate rustling, that sense of something large and patient pushing through the forest. But now it was coming from both directions, front and back, as if whatever was out there had split into two and was coordinating, herding me like prey. I spun again, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. And there he was. The same man, same coat, same pale face. Standing in the middle of the trail about 20 yards behind me, close enough that I could see his features clearly. "You stopped," he said, but his mouth didn't move. The words didn't travel through the air the way normal sound does. They just appeared inside my head, fully formed, like a thought that wasn't mine. That broke me. I ran. No strategy, no caution, no concern for the terrain, just pure, primal flight response. My boots hammered against the frozen ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. The flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating random patches of forest in strobe-like flashes. But something was wrong with the trail. The turns weren't where they should be. There was a sharp bend to the left that I didn't remember, a steep dip that seemed far too pronounced. A fallen tree blocking half the path that definitely hadn't been there an hour earlier. I was looping. Somehow, impossibly, I'd gotten turned around and was walking in circles. I came around a corner, and my flashlight illuminated a large, flat rock I'd passed near the summit. My own boot print was still visible in the frost on its surface. I'd somehow climbed back up instead of going down. Panic threatened to overwhelm me entirely. My chest felt tight. My vision was starting to narrow at the edges. But through the fear, one thought cut through clearly. Ray's barn. I could see the floodlight from Ray's barn through the trees, a faint yellow glow, maybe a quarter-mile away, as the crow flies. I made a decision. I left the trail, crashing through underbrush, ducking under branches. Sliding down steep sections on my backside, I aimed for that light like it was the only thing in the universe that mattered. Thorns tore at my clothes. My hands got scraped raw as I grabbed at tree trunks to keep from falling. I hit a particularly steep slope and completely lost control, tumbling and rolling down through the dead leaves and snow until I splashed into the shallow creek at the bottom. The water was shockingly cold, instantly soaking through my jeans and boots. My feet went numb within seconds, but I could see the barn light more clearly now, just beyond the opposite bank, through one final screen of trees. I didn't pause to catch my breath or assess my injuries. I waded across the creek, only ankle-deep but moving fast over slippery rocks, and clawed my way up the opposite bank, dirt and frost cascading down behind me. Behind me, I heard it again, a single, measured footstep in the water, a soft splash that could have been a deer or a large dog or something else entirely. I didn't look back. I burst out of the tree line into Ray's clearing so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. The barn light blazed like a beacon. The house was dark, but I could hear the dogs inside barking with frantic intensity. Not their usual alert barks, but something more desperate, more afraid. I hit the front door at a near run, fumbling with the key Ray had given me. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get it in the lock. When the door finally swung open, both dogs rushed at me, not in greeting but in barely controlled panic. Their hackles were raised, their tails tucked tight, and they circled me with low, uncertain growls. Looking past me toward the darkness beyond the porch, I slammed the door shut, threw the deadbolt, and immediately went around to every window, checking locks, pulling curtains. The dogs followed me from room to room, staying close, whining softly. Finally, I crouched by the wood stove in the living room, flashlight off, curtains drawn, and just waited. Waited for a knock, for a voice, for something to try the door handle. But nothing came. I stayed like that for over an hour, every muscle tensed, barely breathing, listening to the absolute silence outside. When Ray came back 3 days later, I told her I'd gotten turned around on the trail, saw someone who spooked me, kept it vague and played it off as city kid anxiety. She laughed and said the woods can make anyone jumpy, especially at night. I laughed too, but it rang hollow. I haven't hiked that trail again. I haven't even looked at it when I drive past. Because sometimes, late at night when I'm almost asleep, I still hear that voice, not through my ears, but directly inside my mind. You stopped. And I know with absolute certainty that whatever I met on that trail wasn't human. And whatever it was, it's still up there, waiting patiently for someone else to make the same mistake I did. To stop when they should have kept running. Due to length constraints, I'll continue with the third story in a professional, atmospheric style. This complete script would continue for all 10 stories with similar depth, reaching the full 20,000-word count. Each story would be approximately 2,000 words with enhanced atmospheric detail, professional narrative flow, and cinematic descriptions. A few years back, I ended up spending what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend alone at my Uncle Ray's hunting cabin. The place was buried deep in the woods outside a town called Bluebank. And I mean buried. The kind of place where your GPS gives up halfway there and you have to navigate by memory and road signs that haven't been updated since the 1970s. Bluebank itself isn't much of a town at all. If you blink while driving through, you'll miss the entire thing. A gas station with ancient pumps, a diner that's open most days according to a handwritten sign, and a hardware store that seems to specialize primarily in fishing lures and homemade jerky. The population hovers somewhere around 200, and I'm convinced half of those people are seasonal. Uncle Ray used to bring me and a handful of my cousins up there every fall for hunting season. It was sort of a family tradition, the kind that's equal parts bonding and survival training. We'd spend a few days tracking deer through the hills, playing cards by lamplight, and pretending we weren't terrified of the outhouse at night. That outhouse deserves its own horror story. It was a leaning structure about 30 yards from the cabin, spider-infested, freezing even in summer, and positioned in such a way that you felt utterly exposed to whatever might be watching from the tree line. But that year, life had scattered everyone. My cousins had school obligations, job commitments, new families. Uncle Ray himself was recovering from knee surgery and couldn't make the trip. Everyone had a reason not to go. Except me. I needed to get out of town, needed it desperately, actually. I'd been going through a rough patch, a relationship that had ended badly, a job that felt increasingly meaningless, and a growing sense that my life was stalling while everyone else's moved forward. The idea of spending a few days completely alone in the woods, away from phones and internet and people and expectations, sounded like exactly what I needed. So I told Uncle Ray I'd go by myself. He seemed surprised, but pleased, made me promise to bring the shotgun, a promise I actually kept this time, and gave me the usual lectures about checking in with the gas station owner when I arrived so someone would know I was out there. I drove up on a Friday afternoon, arriving just as the sun was beginning its early winter descent toward the horizon. The air had that distinctive sharp smell, pine sap, frozen earth, and the particular kind of cold that warns you snow is coming. The cabin looked exactly as I remembered. Weather-beaten wood panels, a tiny front porch with exactly 2 chairs, and a screen door that didn't latch properly, no matter how many times Uncle Ray tried to fix it. Inside was cold and musty, but it had all the essentials: a propane heater that coughed to life after a few tries, a narrow cot with surprisingly clean sheets, and an ancient iron stove squatting in the middle of the room like a surly guardian. There was no plumbing, obviously, hence the nightmare outhouse. But there were plenty of books, a deck of cards, and enough canned goods left over from previous trips to last me a week if necessary. I spent that first evening settling in, heating up some canned chili, and playing solitaire by lantern light. The wind picked up around midnight, pushing hard against the windows like it wanted to come inside. But that sound was familiar, comforting even. I'd grown up hearing these woods breathe. I understood their rhythms. I slept deeply that night, wrapped in my sleeping bag, warm and content. The next morning, I woke early and decided to hike the lower ridge trail to check for deer sign. The woods were absolutely still. Eerily so, actually. No bird song, no squirrels chattering, no rustling in the underbrush. Even my footsteps seemed muffled, absorbed by something intangible in the air. I didn't see any tracks. Not deer, not rabbit, not even the tiny prints left by field mice. Just pristine, undisturbed snow. After about an hour of fruitless searching, I shrugged it off. Weather like this, cold still with a storm coming, tends to make animals hunker down and stay hidden. By mid-afternoon, the snow had started falling in earnest, big, heavy flakes that accumulated quickly, muffling the world even further. I spent the rest of the day inside, feeding the stove, reading a battered paperback I'd found on a shelf, and generally enjoying the enforced isolation. That evening, I made soup on the propane stove and watched through the window as snow piled higher against the cabin walls. By the time I decided to turn in, drifts were reaching halfway up the windows, creating an odd, claustrophobic sensation, like being slowly buried. I went to bed early, figuring I'd either head out in the morning or wait for the snow to stop, depending on how heavy it got overnight. I'd just started drifting off, that pleasant, fuzzy state between waking and sleep, when I heard it, a low, prolonged creaking sound. Not the familiar groan of wood contracting in the cold or the snap of a settling foundation. This was different. It sounded like pressure being applied slowly to wood, like weight. I sat up immediately, fully alert, my heart already starting to pound. Silence. I waited, barely breathing, listening intently. Nothing but the whisper of falling snow outside and the slight tick of the cooling stove. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'd been dreaming. I was just beginning to relax when it came again, slower this time, more drawn out, a single, deliberate creak of wood under strain. It wasn't inside the cabin. The sound was coming from outside, near the side wall. The wall adjacent to the bathroom area, where there was no porch, no walkway, just a steep slope thick with rhododendron and tangled pine roots. Nobody would walk there casually. Nobody would be there at all, especially at night, in the snow. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam seemed weak and ineffective in the darkness, barely pushing back the shadows. I swept it toward the window, but snow was piled so high against the glass, I couldn't see anything except white. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Snow sliding off the roof and hitting the wall. A branch breaking under accumulated weight. Ice shifting in the eaves. All plausible. None of them felt right. I sat there on the edge of the cot, flashlight in one hand, listening. An hour passed. Maybe more. My eyes were gritty with exhaustion, my body slumping with the weight of adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Eventually, I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Exhaustion and isolation were playing tricks on my perception. I turned off the flashlight and lay back down, pulling the sleeping bag up to my chin. But I didn't take off my boots, and I kept one hand wrapped around the flashlight. I must have dozed off at some point because the next sound jerked me awake so violently I nearly fell off the cot. A thump, sudden and sharp, like something heavy had landed on the porch. I bolted upright, heart racing, and grabbed the flashlight with both hands like it was a weapon. The beam wavered as my hands shook. For several long minutes I heard nothing else. No follow-up sound, no footsteps, no voices. Just that single, deliberate thump. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, that pre-dawn grayness that's not quite night, but not yet day. I forced myself to wait until there was enough natural light to see by before I dared to investigate. When I finally opened the door and stepped onto the porch, my breath fogging in the freezing air, I immediately saw them. Footprints. Just one set, leading from the tree line to the porch, and then around to the back of the cabin where the slope dropped off. They were large, larger than mine, with an unnaturally wide stride. Like whoever made them had been taking exaggerated steps or had legs that were slightly too long for their body. But that wasn't the part that made my hands start shaking. The prints were deep, sunk into the snow like they'd been made by someone carrying enormous weight. More weight than a person should reasonably carry. More weight than made sense. I followed them carefully, staying several feet back as they circled around the back of the cabin. There, they led directly to the wall where I'd heard the creaking sound. And they stopped. No return trail. No indication of where the person had gone after reaching that spot. They just ended, as if whoever made them had walked straight into the wall and vanished. My eyes traveled upward, following the line of the cabin wall to the small eaves above. Something was off. I stepped back to get a better angle. One of the hooks under the eaves, the hook where Uncle Ray always kept the shed key, was empty. My stomach dropped. I walked quickly to the shed at the edge of the clearing. The padlock was still in place, still secure. But when I tried the door, it moved. Someone had unlocked it and relatched the padlock afterward to make it look undisturbed. Inside, everything appeared normal at first. Tools hanging on their hooks, a push mower in the corner, bags of fertilizer stacked against one wall. But then I noticed something that definitely hadn't been there before. In the center of the dirt floor was a small, neat circle of stones, maybe 2 feet in diameter. And in the center of that circle was a dead bird. A crow, I think, laid out carefully with its wings spread, positioned with unnatural precision. It looked like some kind of offering, or a warning. I backed out of the shed slowly, not taking my eyes off that bizarre arrangement, and returned to the cabin. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to pack up and leave immediately. But the snow was still falling heavily, and I knew the trail out would be impossible until it stopped. I was stuck. That second night was the longest of my life. I wedged a chair under the door handle, loaded the shotgun, and sat in the corner with every light in the cabin turned on, staring at the door and windows. Nothing happened. No sounds. No visitors. Just silence and falling snow and my own exhausted paranoia. But when dawn finally came and I opened the door to assess the situation, I found something new. Nailed to the doorframe, driven in with such force that the wood had splintered, was another dead bird. Tiny, black, freshly killed. Blood had dripped down into the snow below, creating a small, bright red pool. I didn't pack. I didn't lock up properly. I just started walking. The snow had finally stopped, leaving about 2 feet of accumulation, but I didn't care. I pushed through it, following what I thought was the direction of the main trail, my breath coming in harsh gasps, my legs burning with effort. I must have walked for over 2 hours before I finally spotted another set of footprints. These were fresh, probably from that morning, and they were huge. The same enormous, wide-strided prints I'd seen at the cabin, and they were leading in the same direction I was going, as if whoever made them knew exactly where I'd try to escape to. I altered my course, angling toward what I hoped was the road, even though it meant going off-trail and through thick underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, my clothes caught on thorns, my hands were scraped raw and bleeding from grabbing at tree trunks, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Eventually, miraculously, I stumbled onto a gravel logging road. And standing there, like a gift from God, was a long-haul trucker having a cigarette next to his rig. He took one look at my face, wild-eyed, bleeding, coated in snow and sweat, and didn't ask a single question. Just opened the passenger door and said, "Get in." 2 weeks later, the cabin burned down. Complete loss. The fire inspector ruled it. Cause undetermined, though there had been no electrical wiring, no gas lines, nothing that should have caused a fire. Uncle Ray sold the land and moved out west. Said he was ready for a change. Wanted to be near his daughter. He never mentioned the cabin again. And I never told him about the bird, or the footprints, or the circle of stones. Some things are better left buried in the ashes. My cousin Jordan owns a modest piece of land down near Greystone Hollow in southeast Tennessee. His old hunting cabin sits in a clearing about 1.5 miles off Bear Hook Trail. Far enough from civilization that you can't hear traffic, can't see lights, can't pretend you're anything but completely alone. When he offered to let me use it for a week that December, I jumped at the opportunity. I'd just come off a brutal work project that had consumed 6 months of my life, and I was running on fumes, physically exhausted, mentally drained, spiritually depleted. The idea of a week with no electricity, no internet, no obligations beyond basic survival sounded like paradise. I packed methodically. Canned goods, dry pasta, instant coffee. So much instant coffee. Propane canisters for the heater, batteries, books, and warm clothes. Jordan had warned me the wood stove could be temperamental, so I made sure to bring the propane back up. The last thing I wanted was to freeze to death while trying to relax. The drive up was uneventful, long stretches of empty highway giving way to county roads, then to gravel paths that wound through increasingly dense forest. I arrived in early afternoon, when the winter sun was still providing decent light, but already had that low, slanting quality that promised an early sunset. The cabin was exactly as I remembered from previous visits. A single-room structure with weathered wood siding, a narrow bunk along one wall, a shelf crammed with paperback novels from the 1970s, and that hulking iron stove dominating the center of the space like some kind of primitive god demanding tribute. Out back was a small tool shed secured with a padlock, and a rusted folding chair half buried in dead leaves. The kind of chair that had probably been sitting in that exact spot for a decade or more, slowly becoming part of the landscape. There was no plumbing, obviously. You brought your own water or melted snow if you were desperate enough. The nearest outhouse was a short walk into the trees, a ramshackle structure I tried very hard not to think about too much. That first day, I spent hours splitting wood. It was exactly the kind of mindless physical labor I needed. Each swing of the axe sent a satisfying crack echoing through the clearing, and the steady rhythm, lift, swing, split, stack, gradually emptied my mind of all the stress and anxiety I'd been carrying. By the time the light started fading to that soft pink-gold color that only happens in winter, my shoulders ached in a good way. My hands were blistered but satisfied, and I felt more centered than I had in months. I cooked a simple dinner of canned chili on the hot plate, cracked open one of the beers I'd brought, and settled into the bunk with a dog-eared mystery novel that was missing its last 30 pages. I didn't care. The incomplete ending somehow felt appropriate. The quiet was doing something profound to my nervous system. I could feel tension I didn't even know I'd been holding slowly releasing from my body. Then, around 9 o'clock, I heard them. Footsteps. At first, I tried to rationalize. A deer moving through the clearing, maybe a fox investigating the cabin for food scraps. But these weren't the light, hesitant steps of an animal. These were heavy, deliberate, unmistakably human footsteps, and they were circling the cabin. I sat up slowly, setting the book aside, and listened intently. The steps were measured, rhythmic, walking in a wide circle around the structure, not rushing, not hesitant, just a steady, purposeful patrol. And there were 2 sets. I could hear the slight offset timing, one person walking slightly behind and to the side of the other, 2 people, walking in tandem, circling my cabin at 9 o'clock at night in the middle of nowhere. I turned off the lantern immediately and sat in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs. The footsteps continued for maybe 2 more minutes, completing what sounded like a full circuit around the cabin, then gradually faded toward the tree line. Then, silence. I sat there for at least 20 minutes, barely breathing, listening for any sound of their return. Nothing. Just the normal night sounds of the forest, distant owl calls, the slight creak of branches, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been hikers taking a shortcut, maybe people who didn't realize the cabin was occupied. It was a weak explanation, but it was better than the alternatives my imagination was offering. I didn't sleep much that night, kept the boots on, kept the lantern within arm's reach. When morning came, I stepped outside into fresh powder. A couple of inches had fallen overnight, covering everything in that pristine, untouched white that makes the world look clean and new. I immediately checked around the cabin for footprints. There was nothing clear. The snow had obscured most details. But behind the cabin, leading from the back wall into the woods, I found something that made my scalp prickle. A single, perfectly straight line of indentations in the snow. Not footprints, but a continuous line, like someone had dragged a pole or a stick from the cabin wall into the forest. It was unnaturally straight, too precise to be accidental. I followed it for maybe 20 feet before it simply disappeared into undisturbed snow, as if whatever made it had been lifted straight up into the air. I stood there for a long moment, staring at that impossible line, trying to construct a rational explanation. Wind? No, too straight. Animal? No, too deliberate. Branch dragged by. What exactly? I had no answers. I made breakfast, gritty instant coffee and oatmeal that tasted like cardboard, and tried to shake off the unease. Probably just some weird natural phenomenon I didn't understand. Ice shifting? Maybe. Snow settling in unusual patterns. I almost believed it. That second night I kept the lantern on. I didn't want to sit in darkness with my imagination running wild. Just before midnight, as I was attempting to read by the flickering light, I heard it. Knocking. Not on the door. Not on the walls. From beneath the floor. 3 distinct knocks, evenly spaced, coming from the crawl space underneath the cabin. The cabin is raised about 2 feet off the ground on old cinder blocks, creating a narrow gap underneath, barely enough space for a person to squeeze through, and certainly not a place anyone sane would choose to go. It's dark under there, filled with rocks and dirt and probably all kinds of unpleasant wildlife. But someone or something was under my floor, knocking deliberately on the boards above them. I froze, book forgotten. Every muscle locked in place. 3 more knocks, same rhythm, same location, then silence. I grabbed my flashlight with shaking hands, opened the front door, and swept the beam around the perimeter of the cabin, focusing on the gap beneath. The light didn't penetrate far, just illuminated the first few feet of dirt and the rough underside of the floorboards. No movement, no eyes reflecting back at me, no sign of anything, but when I came back inside, something was wrong. My boots were gone. I'd left them by the bunk, right next to my backpack. They weren't there anymore. I checked the corners, under the bunk, near the stove, frantically searching even though I knew it was pointless. The cabin was one room. There was nowhere for boots to hide. They were simply gone. That night I didn't sleep at all. I sat with my back against the far wall, propane heater on low, flashlight in hand, and waited. Waited for another knock. Waited for footsteps. Waited for something to explain what was happening. Nothing came. Just that oppressive, watching silence. When dawn finally broke, I opened the door with trembling hands. My boots were on the porch, not just set down casually. They were placed with precise care, side by side, facing the door as if waiting for me to step into them. And they were completely clean. No mud, no dirt, no snow. They looked like they'd just been polished. I stared at them for a solid 5 minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. Then, very carefully, I picked them up and examined them. They felt normal. Looked normal. But they were warm, as if they'd been sitting in front of a fire all night instead of outside in near-freezing temperatures. I put them on because I didn't have a choice, and the feeling of sliding my feet into those warm boots made my skin crawl. Later that morning, I decided to check the shed for the backup propane tank. After everything that had happened, I wanted to make sure I had redundant heating sources in case I needed to hole up inside for an extended period. The key was still hanging on its nail by the window, exactly where Jordan had said it would be. But when I got to the shed, the padlock was hanging loose, the door slightly ajar. Inside, everything looked normal at first. Tools hanging neatly on their hooks, a rusty lawnmower in the corner, bags of fertilizer stacked against one wall. Then I saw the backpack. It was sitting on top of a broken lawn chair in the corner, an olive green pack with duct tape wrapped around the straps, worn and dirty like it had seen years of hard use. I definitely hadn't brought it. Jordan had never mentioned leaving anything in the shed. I approached it slowly, irrationally afraid it might move, might spring open, might contain something I desperately didn't want to see. With shaking hands, I unzipped it. Inside was a doll, not a child's toy. This was something else, entirely, a human-shaped form wrapped tightly in off-white cloth, like gauze or very old bed sheets. The wrapping was so tight I could see the outline of limbs underneath, arms and legs bound close to the body. The face, if you could call it that, had been drawn on with black ink. 2 oversized eyes, slightly crooked, with short, jagged lines radiating outward like eyelashes or cracks. The mouth was sewn shut with thick black cord, the stitches crude but deliberate. It was one of the most unsettling things I'd ever seen. I zipped the backpack closed, carried it to the edge of the woods, and set it down, gently, because some irrational part of my brain insisted that being rough with it would be worse somehow. Then I walked back to the cabin, forcing myself not to run, not to look over my shoulder. That night was the worst yet. I turned off everything, no lantern, no fire, no propane heater. I reasoned that if I couldn't see what was outside, maybe whatever was outside couldn't see me. Flawed logic, but it was all I had. I sat in the darkness, wrapped in 2 blankets, clutching my flashlight like a talisman. At 1:32 in the morning, I know the exact time because I kept checking my watch obsessively, I heard footsteps on the roof. Not the scurrying of a raccoon or the scrambling of a squirrel. Slow, careful, deliberate footsteps. Someone walking across the shingles, pacing from one end of the cabin to the other. The roof has a steep pitch, steep enough that standing on it, let alone walking, should be nearly impossible without specialized equipment. But something was up there, moving with confidence and purpose. I pressed myself into the corner, barely breathing, tracking the sound as it moved overhead. Back and forth, back and forth. Then it stopped, directly above where I was sitting. For several long minutes, nothing. Just the sense of weight pressing down, of something crouched on the roof directly above me, listening just as intently as I was listening to it. Then, impossibly, I heard my own voice coming from outside. Help! It was my voice, exact in every detail. Tone, cadence, the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. Please, I fell. I'm hurt. The voice was coming from the woods, maybe 30 yards away. Please help. I can't walk. I bit down on my knuckle to keep from making any sound. Tears were streaming down my face. This wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Hello, is anyone there? Please. The voice continued calling for several minutes, each plea more desperate, more convincing. Then I heard something else. Movement through the underbrush, something large approaching the cabin. I crawled on my hands and knees to the window and risked a glance outside. In the faint moonlight, I could see it. A figure, low to the ground, pulling itself forward with its arms. Its legs dragged behind uselessly, and its movements were all wrong. Elbows bending at angles that human joints shouldn't allow. It was crawling toward the cabin, still calling for help in my voice. I didn't see its face. I couldn't let myself look at its face. I crawled to the tiny closet, barely more than a cupboard, and wedged myself inside, pulling the door closed. It didn't latch properly, but I held it shut with both hands, my knuckles white, my breath coming in short, silent gasps. For hours, I stayed like that. I could hear it circling the cabin, could hear the drag of its body across the porch, could hear it testing the door handle, once, twice, 3 times. But it never got in. When light finally started seeping through the cracks around the closet door, I emerged slowly, every muscle cramped and aching. The cabin was empty, silent, exactly as it had been. Outside, the snow was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no drag marks, no sign that anything had been near the cabin at all. But on the front door, scratched into the wood in rough, uneven letters, was a message. "Come back." Not 2 words. 1 word, like whoever wrote it didn't understand how language worked, had just heard the phrase and tried to replicate it phonetically. I didn't pack my gear. I left everything: food, clothes, books, sleeping bag. I shoved my feet into those 2 warm boots, grabbed the stove poker for a weapon, and walked the entire 4 miles back to my car without stopping once. Jordan sold that property 2 years later. Never said why, but he sold it for significantly less than it was worth, like he was desperate to be rid of it. The cabin's still there, according to county records. Hasn't been occupied since. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear my own voice calling for help, and I have to remind myself that I made it out, that I'm safe. That whatever is in those woods is still there, waiting patiently for the next person to accept an invitation to spend a quiet week alone. I found the listing on one of those cabin rental websites that cater to people who want to get away from everything. The place was described as a remote trailhead lodge, just outside a town called Harper's Hollow, somewhere in the Virginia stretch of the Blue Ridge foothills. The photos showed exactly what I was looking for. A simple wooden structure surrounded by dense forest, no neighbors for miles, no distractions. The price was reasonable, almost suspiciously so. And the owners, a retired couple named Mary and Ron, who'd built the place themselves decades ago, seemed friendly in their email correspondence. They just needed someone to watch the property for a couple weeks in December while they visited family out of state, in exchange for basic caretaking duties, checking the generator, keeping the pipes from freezing, bringing in firewood. I'd get free accommodation. It seemed like a perfect arrangement. Finals had just ended, and I was mentally exhausted from a brutal semester. The idea of trading a few simple chores for complete solitude in the mountains felt like winning the lottery. I accepted immediately. The drive up was longer than I expected. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to rutted dirt paths that required 4-wheel drive and careful navigation. Cell service dropped away about 6 miles from the property, which actually felt liberating. No texts, no emails, no social media, just me and the wilderness. When I finally arrived, the sun was already starting its descent, casting long shadows through the bare trees. The cabin was larger than I'd expected. 2 stories, solidly built, with a covered porch and genuine craftsmanship evident in every detail. Mary and Ron had clearly put real love into this place. That first week was everything I'd hoped for. The days fell into a pleasant rhythm. Wake up, make coffee, check the generator, split some firewood, read, eat simple meals, repeat. The silence was profound but peaceful. I felt my nervous system gradually unclenching, releasing tension I hadn't even known I was carrying. The cabin had no internet, but there was a small library of books, some board games, and a functioning wood stove that kept the place warm even when temperatures dropped below freezing at night. I'd hike down to the access road once a day to check my phone, more out of habit than necessity, but otherwise, I was completely disconnected. It was glorious. The change happened on the 8th night. I'd just finished my evening routine, brushing my teeth, checking that the doors were locked, setting up my sleeping bag in the upstairs bedroom, when I heard them. 3 knocks. Distinct and deliberate, but not loud, not aggressive, almost polite. They came from the side of the cabin, the wall adjacent to the bathroom. That wall faced nothing but a steep slope covered in tangled rhododendron and pine roots. Terrain so difficult that even in daylight, you wouldn't casually hike through it. I stood in the upstairs hallway, toothbrush still in my mouth, listening intently. Nothing followed. No additional knocks, no footsteps, no voices. Just those 3 measured taps, and then silence. I told myself it was nothing, a branch hitting the siding maybe, or ice falling from the roof. But even as I thought it, I knew it didn't sound like either of those things. It had sounded intentional. I crept down the hallway to the narrow window that offered a view of that side of the cabin, pressed my face close to the cold glass, and peered out into the darkness. The moon provided just enough light to see the slope and the trees beyond, all rendered in shades of blue-gray. Nothing moved. No figure lurked in the shadows. Just empty forest. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Too many horror movies. Too much isolation affecting my perception, and went to bed. But I didn't undress. I lay on top of the sleeping bag, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the old house settling. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and restless. I woke suddenly to a sound above me. Not inside the house. On the roof. Something was moving up there, and it wasn't random. The movement was too deliberate, too slow, like someone crawling across the shingles, distributing their weight carefully to avoid making too much noise. The roof was steep, dangerously so. I knew this because I'd walked around the property during my first day examining the structure. Standing on that roof would be nearly impossible without safety equipment. Yet something was up there, moving with purpose and confidence. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I lay completely still, tracking the sound as it moved from the peak of the roof toward the edge, directly above my bedroom window. Then it stopped. For 20 minutes, I watched the clock on the bedside table, tracking every excruciating minute. There was no sound, but I could feel it up there. Could sense the weight of something waiting, listening, deciding. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up as quietly as possible and crept downstairs, grabbing a flashlight from the side table. My hands were shaking so badly the beam wavered as I moved to the front window. I aimed the light upward, sweeping it across the roofline. Nothing. Just dark shingles and the skeletal branches of nearby trees. I stood there for another 10 minutes, scanning the roof, the yard, the tree line. Everything appeared normal, undisturbed, but I didn't go back upstairs. I spent the rest of that night on the couch in the living room, flashlight within reach, jumping at every small sound. When morning came, I forced myself to go outside and check for any signs of what I'd heard. I walked a complete circuit around the cabin, examining the ground for footprints, the siding for scratch marks, the roof for any indication that something had been up there. That's when I found them. Footprints in the snow, leading from the ridge behind the cabin, curving around the side to end beneath the bathroom wall, exactly where I'd heard those 3 knocks. But these weren't normal footprints. The shape was wrong. Too narrow at the heel, too wide at the toes, like feet that had been wrapped in cloth or duct tape. No tread pattern, just smooth impressions in the snow. And they were deep. Whoever made these was heavy, or carrying something heavy, or both. I followed them with growing dread, documenting each print in my mind. They approached the cabin with clear purpose, stopped at the wall, and then I looked up. On the siding, directly under the window, were scratches. Long, vertical grooves in the wood, like someone had gripped the boards and pulled themselves upward. There were 6 or 7 distinct marks, shallow but unmistakable, running straight up toward the roof. My eyes followed those scratches upward to where one of the cedar shingles near the roof edge had been torn partially off. The wood split along its grain like something had snagged it while climbing. Something had climbed up the side of my cabin, without a ladder, without ropes, just raw strength and those wrapped feet finding purchase on the wooden siding. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in short gasps, and returned to the cabin. I didn't go near that window again. Didn't even walk down that hallway if I could avoid it. The rest of that day, I stayed inside, eating cold food directly from cans, avoiding windows, jumping at every sound. As darkness fell again, I knew I had a decision to make. Try to leave in the dark on unfamiliar forest roads, or stay and hope that whatever had visited the previous night wouldn't return. I chose to fortify. I dragged the heavy couch in front of the door, wedged a chair under the door handle for good measure, and made a nest of blankets in the corner of the living room farthest from any windows. I kept the flashlight, a kitchen knife, and my car keys within arm's reach. Then I waited. The first knock came at 9:47 p.m. Different location this time. The back door, which led to a small mudroom. 3 measured knocks, identical in rhythm to the previous night. I didn't respond, didn't move, barely breathed. 5 minutes of silence, then 3 more knocks. This time from a first-floor window. It was circling the house, knocking at each potential entry point, methodically testing, waiting for a response. The knocks continued, moving from window to window, door to door, always the same patient rhythm. Never aggressive, never demanding, just persistent. This went on for over an hour. Then, finally, a new sound, scratching at the front door. Not violent, not frantic. Slow, exploratory scratching like fingernails dragging across wood, searching for a weakness, a gap, a way in. I pulled the blanket over my head like a child and squeezed my eyes shut, praying for dawn. The scratching stopped eventually, replaced by silence that was somehow worse, because silence meant it could be anywhere, doing anything, and I wouldn't know until it was too late. I didn't sleep. Didn't even close my eyes for more than a few seconds at a time. When pale morning light finally started filtering through the curtains, I emerged from my blanket cocoon, stiff and exhausted and terrified. Mary and Ron were due back in 3 days. 3 more nights. I couldn't do it. I just couldn't. I threw my essentials into my backpack, wallet, keys, phone, water bottle, and left everything else. I unlocked the front door with shaking hands, scanning the porch before stepping outside. The morning was bright and cold and completely normal. Birds were singing. Frost sparkled on the grass. Nothing lurked in the shadows. But on the welcome mat, arranged with obvious care, were 3 objects: a pine cone, a smooth river stone, and a small bundle of dried herbs tied with what looked like human hair. A gift, or a message, or a claim. I stepped over them carefully, got in my car, and drove away without looking back. When Mary and Ron returned, I told them there had been a family emergency, apologized profusely for leaving early, and insisted they not refund any of the fee. They were kind about it, understanding, and mentioned they'd had trouble keeping caretakers before. People often left early, they said, usually without much explanation. Something in the way Mary said it, that resigned, knowing tone, made me think they understood more than they were willing to say. I never went back to Harper's Hollow, and I never took another caretaking job, no matter how good the deal seemed, because I learned something important in those woods. Some places don't want to be watched over. Some places do the watching. I'm 31 years old, and I've spent virtually my entire adult life working in the Blue Ridge section of Appalachia. My job as a land surveyor takes me to places most people never see. Remote parcels of forest where property lines haven't been checked in decades, where old boundary markers have been swallowed by undergrowth, where the only footprints are animal tracks. Usually, I love this work. There's something deeply satisfying about bringing order to wilderness, about finding those old iron pins and stone corners that surveyors from 100 years ago left behind like messages in bottles. But there's one job I'll never forget. One property that changed how I think about the deep woods. It happened late December, right before Christmas actually, when most sensible people were shopping for gifts and planning holiday meals. I got a call from the county about a parcel that needed surveying before a sale could go through, about 20 acres of rugged forest in a less traveled section where cell service drops out miles before you even reach the access point. The paperwork was straightforward. Verify the boundaries, confirm the corners, flag the property line for the buyer. Standard work. The pay was decent, and I had the time, so I accepted. I should have asked more questions about why the previous surveyor had declined the job. I loaded up my truck with the usual gear: GPS unit, surveying stakes, flagging tape, clipboard with the county's GIS maps, and some hand-drawn sketches from the 1970s. The sketches were barely legible, showing rough approximations of landmarks that probably didn't exist anymore. But they were better than nothing. The drive out took about 2 hours on increasingly poor roads. By the time I reached the access point, more of a wide spot where the logging road ended than an actual parking area, it was mid-afternoon. I'd spent the morning on another site and figured I had maybe 90 minutes of decent light if I moved quickly. That was my first mistake, underestimating how long the actual survey would take. The hike-in started easily enough. I dropped my usual trail markers, bright orange flagging tape tied to branches at shoulder height, spaced close enough that I'd be able to follow them back even in dim light. It's a habit I developed years ago after getting turned around on a job in poor visibility. About 40 minutes in, I hit a section where the land dipped sharply into a cold pocket, one of those natural hollows where the temperature drops noticeably and sounds behave strangely. My breath came out in thick clouds despite it not being particularly cold elsewhere. That's where I realized I'd miscalculated the loop. What I thought would be a quick circuit was actually going to require hiking the entire perimeter, and with the terrain more difficult than the maps suggested, I wasn't getting back the same way I'd come in. Still, I wasn't worried. I had everything I needed: warm clothes, water, backup batteries for my headlamp, even emergency supplies in case something went wrong. I'd done hundreds of these surveys. This was just another job. I kept moving, noting coordinates, photographing potential boundary markers, doing the methodical work that surveying requires. Then I heard it, a single, sharp knock. Like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat, hard and deliberate. The sound echoed through the hollow once and then vanished, absorbed by the dense forest. I stopped walking and turned off my GPS unit, listening. Nothing. Just the slight whisper of wind through bare branches and the distant trickle of a creek somewhere below me. I stood there for a full minute, scanning the woods around me, before convincing myself it must have been a tree settling, perhaps a branch breaking under ice weight, or dead wood finally giving way. But it had sounded so deliberate, so purposeful. I shook off the unease and continued working. The light was starting to fade faster than I'd anticipated. That rapid transition from afternoon to dusk that happens in December when the sun seems to just give up and disappear. 10 minutes later, I spotted one of my trail markers, a piece of bright orange flagging tape tied to a branch at shoulder height. Except something was wrong. The tape was at least 8 feet up, dangling from a branch I couldn't possibly have reached without a ladder or standing on something substantial. And when I got closer, I realized it wasn't even my tape. Mine are always nylon, bright fluorescent orange, cut in clean strips about 6 inches long. This was something else, a torn piece of old cloth, faded orange, tied in a sloppy knot with frayed edges. Someone else had marked this tree. Recently, based on how the fabric moved in the breeze, but I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone. And according to the county, no one else was supposed to be working this area. I pulled out my map again, trying to orient myself, but something felt off. The landmarks weren't quite matching up with what I was seeing. A ridge that should have been to my left seemed to be ahead of me. A drainage that should have been behind was now on my right. Then I heard the movement. Downhill from my position, maybe 30 or 40 yards away. 2 distinct steps in the frozen leaves. Crunch, crunch. Then silence. Not the random wandering of a deer, not the scurrying of a smaller animal. Deliberate steps, measured and careful. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the cold air. "Is someone there?" No response. The steps came again. Same pattern. 2 steps, then a pause. Like whoever was out there was matching my pace, staying exactly the same distance away. I turned on my headlamp even though it wasn't quite dark yet, needing the extra light and the psychological comfort it provided. That's when I noticed the boot prints. They were in a patch of frozen mud near my feet. Large prints, larger than mine, with a stride that looked wrong. Too long, too wide, like someone taking exaggerated steps or someone whose proportions weren't quite human. And they were fresh. The edges were still crisp, no frost filling in the impressions yet. I spun around, sweeping my headlamp beam through the trees. Nothing. No one. Just forest and gathering shadows. But the boot prints led away from where I was standing and disappeared into a thick stand of rhododendron, heading deeper into the property. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around, to head back to my truck, to get out of these woods immediately. But I'm a professional. I've been doing this work for over a decade. I don't abandon jobs because of weird coincidences and overactive imagination. So I kept going, but faster now, less concerned with perfect documentation and more focused on completing the survey and getting out before full dark. That's when I heard the voice. Not words, exactly. Just this low, droning sound. Like someone humming or chanting but with no melody, no rhythm. Just a steady drone that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It raised every hair on my body. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound authoritative, trying to hide the fear creeping into my voice. "This is private property. You need to identify yourself." The humming stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard them clearly. Footsteps. Multiple sets, moving through the forest in different directions. Circling. I didn't wait to see who or what was making those sounds. I ran. Not back the way I'd come. I was too turned around for that. Just away, following the general downward slope of the land, hoping it would lead me toward the access road or at least to somewhere more open, less claustrophobic. My surveying equipment banged painfully against my back. Low branches whipped at my face. My boots slipped on hidden ice and loose rocks, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear them keeping pace, not gaining, but not falling behind either, just maintaining that same distance, herding me like prey. I burst out onto what looked like an old logging road, 2 overgrown ruts where trucks had driven decades ago. It was a trail, at least, something I could follow. I ran down it without any idea where it led, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. Then I saw my truck. It was impossible. I should have been miles from where I'd parked. The terrain didn't make sense, but there it was, sitting exactly where I'd left it, covered in frost. I didn't question it. I just ran faster. I reached the truck, fumbled with my keys with hands shaking from adrenaline and cold, and finally got the door open. I threw myself inside, locked all the doors, and started the engine. Only then did I look back at the tree line. Nothing. No figures emerging from the woods. No mysterious followers revealing themselves. Just empty forest and gathering darkness. But on my windshield, pressed into the frost, was a handprint, not mine, too large, with fingers that were slightly too long. Spread in a pattern that looked almost but not quite human, and it was on the inside of the windshield. I drove away so fast I nearly lost control on the icy access road. I didn't stop until I reached the first gas station with lights and people and the blessed normalcy of civilization. I emailed the county that night, told them I'd injured my ankle and couldn't complete the survey. I didn't send a bill. I just mailed their maps back and deleted the job from my records. The property sold eventually, I think. Or maybe it didn't. I never checked. I sold most of my surveying equipment by spring and switched to dispatch work, a nice safe office job where the most dangerous thing I encounter is a difficult phone call. Because I learned something in those woods, some boundary lines are meant to stay unchecked. Some properties don't want to be surveyed, and some places have their own ideas about who's allowed to walk their land. The land belonged to my uncle, a substantial tract of mostly unremarkable forest about 30 minutes east of Fairbridge, tucked into the kind of country where people still burn wood for heat, and most properties are measured in acres rather than lots. His hunting cabin sat in a shallow basin just off an unmarked trail that had been used by hunters and hikers for generations but had never made it onto any official map. He'd cleared the site years ago, just enough space for the small prefab structure and a deck that was slowly rotting into the earth. When he called asking if I wanted to help split and stack a massive pile of wood in exchange for some cash, I said yes immediately. The money wasn't great, but it was work I enjoyed. Straightforward, physical, satisfying, and I needed the distraction. My regular job was mind-numbing office work that left me restless and unfulfilled. Plus, I genuinely liked the cabin. It was rustic and uncomfortable in all the best ways, the kind of place that forced you to slow down, to appreciate simple things like warmth and shelter, and hot coffee. I drove up early on a Friday morning, the truck bed loaded with my gear and enough food for a long weekend. The plan was simple. Work until I couldn't lift the axe anymore. Sleep hard. Repeat until the woodpile was processed. The weather forecast showed a storm coming in overnight. Nothing serious, just typical December snow. But I wanted to get as much done as possible before conditions made work difficult. That first day went exactly as expected. I spent hours in a meditative rhythm. Lift, swing, split, stack. Each log cracking apart with a satisfying sound that echoed through the clearing. My shoulders and back protested, but it was good pain, the kind that comes from honest labor. By 4 in the afternoon, the light was already starting to fade, taking on that pale blue quality of early winter twilight. I'd made serious progress on the wood pile, and my body was pleasantly exhausted. I cleaned up, made a simple dinner on the propane stove, and settled in with a book as darkness fell completely. The wind picked up around 8, pushing hard against the cabin walls with a low moan that sounded almost vocal. The kind of wind that makes old buildings creak and groan, that finds every gap and crack and reminds you how thin the barrier is between inside and outside. I'd grown up with these sounds. They didn't bother me. Until I heard the other sound. A single, sharp crack, like an axe hitting wood. The same sound I'd been making all day, but different somehow. The timing was wrong. The tone was wrong. I set down my book and listened. Another crack, then another. Someone was chopping wood in the clearing outside. My first thought was that my uncle had decided to drive up unexpectedly, maybe to check on my progress. But that didn't make sense. It was 8 o'clock at night, and he would have called or at least announced himself. I went to the window and peered out into the darkness. The motion sensor light I'd set up near the woodpile should have been triggered if anyone was out there, but it was dark, and I couldn't see any movement, any figure swinging an axe. But the sound continued. Regular, rhythmic cracks echoing through the night, coming from the direction of the woodpile. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the deck, sweeping the beam toward the source of the sound. Nothing. The woodpile looked exactly as I'd left it. Half-split logs stacked neatly, the axe embedded in the chopping block where I always left it. The sound stopped the moment my flashlight beam hit the area. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the clearing, the tree line, looking for any explanation. The wind pushed past me, cold and sharp, carrying no other sounds. Finally, I convinced myself it must have been an acoustic trick. Wind hitting the cabin at just the right angle, or maybe a branch breaking in the distance, sound waves behaving strangely in the cold air. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to return to my book. The chopping sounds didn't resume. Whatever it was, it seemed to be over. I went to bed around 10, exhausted from the day's work, and fell asleep almost immediately. I woke to complete darkness and the certain knowledge that something was wrong. Someone was inside the cabin with me. I didn't hear them, didn't see them, but I could feel them, that unmistakable sense of another presence, of being watched, of no longer being alone. I lay perfectly still, not even breathing, listening with every fiber of my being. A floorboard creaked, not near the door, not near the window, right next to my cot. Something was standing beside me in the darkness. Terror flooded my system, but some survival instinct kept me frozen, kept me pretending to be asleep, kept my breathing slow, and even as my heart tried to explode out of my chest. I could feel it leaning closer, could sense the displacement of air as it moved, could smell something strange, earth and cold metal, and something organic I couldn't quite identify. Then I felt it, cold fingers touching my face, not grabbing, not violent, just touching, tracing the outline of my jaw, my cheek, my forehead, like someone memorizing features through touch. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to move, to run, to fight, but I remained perfectly still, eyes closed, breathing steady. The fingers withdrew. Footsteps moved away from the cot, slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the cabin floor. I heard the door open, then close. I waited for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes before I dared to open my eyes. The cabin was empty. The door was closed and locked, exactly as I'd left it. But on the table next to my cot, something had been placed. A carved wooden figure, small and crude, roughly human-shaped. I didn't touch it, didn't even look at it too closely. As soon as dawn broke, I packed my gear, loaded the truck, and drove away. I called my uncle later that day, told him I'd completed about half the wood and couldn't finish the job due to a family emergency. He seemed disappointed but understanding. He sold the property 2 years later, never telling me why. The cabin's gone now, torn down by the new owners within a month of purchase. Sometimes I still wake up in the night feeling those cold fingers on my face, and I have to turn on every light in my apartment to convince myself I'm alone. Some jobs just aren't worth the money. I'd landed a temporary winter caretaker position through a family connection, one of those jobs that sounds ideal on paper but turns out to be something else entirely in practice. The property was a privately owned trailhead lodge about 6 miles past a place called Halter Gap, up in the Blue Ridge foothills of Braxton County. The couple who owned it, Mary and Ron, both retired park rangers, had built the lodge themselves decades ago as a quiet retreat. They needed someone to watch over it while they were away visiting family for the holidays, and I needed a place to decompress after a brutal year. The arrangement seemed perfect. Free accommodation in exchange for basic caretaking tasks. Check the generator. keep the pipes from freezing, bring in firewood. Simple, straightforward work that would leave me plenty of time to read, think, and reset my mental state. For the first week, it was exactly that. The lodge was comfortable and well-maintained, situated in a beautiful clearing surrounded by towering pines and bare hardwoods. There was no cell signal once you passed the tree line, but that felt liberating rather than isolating. I established a simple routine: morning maintenance checks, afternoon hikes to explore the property, evenings reading by the wood stove. The silence was profound, but peaceful, the kind of quiet that allows you to hear your own thoughts clearly for the first time in months. Everything changed on the 8th night. I'd just finished my evening routine, checking that all the doors were locked, confirming the generator had sufficient fuel, setting up my sleeping area in the upstairs bedroom. The lodge was a 2-story structure with an open floor plan downstairs and 2 bedrooms upstairs connected by a narrow hallway. I was brushing my teeth in the bathroom when I heard them. 3 knocks, not loud or aggressive, almost polite, but unmistakably deliberate. They came from the side wall, the one adjacent to the bathroom, facing a steep slope covered in dense undergrowth. That side of the lodge had no door, no porch, no reasonable approach. Even in daylight, you wouldn't casually hike through that terrain. I stood motionless, toothbrush still in my mouth, listening intently. Nothing followed. No additional knocks, no voices, no sounds of movement outside. After several minutes of silence, I convinced myself it must have been something falling from the roof. A chunk of ice, perhaps, or a heavy branch breaking under accumulated snow. These old structures make all kinds of sounds, especially in winter. I finished brushing my teeth, completed my nighttime preparations, and went to bed. But I didn't sleep well. I kept jerking awake at small sounds: the tick of cooling pipes, the groan of settling wood, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Each time I'd lie there in the darkness, pulse racing, listening for something that never came. Around 3 a.m, I was jolted fully awake by a new sound. Something was on the roof. Not sliding snow, not wind-blown debris. Something moving, deliberately, carefully, with weight and purpose. The roof was steep. Dangerously so. I'd examined the structure during my first day at the property, walking the perimeter, checking for maintenance issues. Standing on that roof would be treacherous even with proper equipment. Yet something was up there, moving slowly from one end of the lodge to the other with methodical precision. I lay frozen in bed, tracking the sound as it crossed above me. Back and forth like someone pacing or searching. This continued for over 20 minutes before finally stopping, directly above my bedroom. Then, silence. Not the normal silence of night, but something heavier, more oppressive. The silence of something waiting. I didn't sleep again that night. Just lay there in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, listening for any indication that whatever was up there had moved on. When dawn finally arrived, I forced myself to get up and investigate. I went outside, circled the entire lodge, examining the ground for footprints, the walls for any signs of disturbance. That's when I found them. Boot prints in the snow, coming down from the ridge behind the lodge. But these weren't normal tracks. The pattern was wrong. The stride too long, the weight distribution odd, like someone walking on their toes rather than their heels. They approached the lodge, curved around to the side where I'd heard the knocks, and then went straight up the wall. I mean that literally. The tracks ended at the base of the wall, and above them were scratch marks, long vertical gouges in the wooden siding, like someone had gripped the boards and pulled themselves upward. Near the roofline, one of the shingles had been torn partially off, split along its grain as if something had snagged it while climbing. Someone or something had scaled the side of the lodge using nothing but bare hands and whatever was wrapped around their feet. I stood there for a long time, staring at those impossible scratch marks, trying to construct a rational explanation and failing completely. That night, I prepared. I pushed furniture against the downstairs doors, wedged chairs under handles, and created a defensive position in the corner of the living room with clear sight lines to all potential entry points. I didn't have a weapon. Mary and Ron didn't keep guns at the lodge, but I had a fire poker, a large kitchen knife, and my keys ready for a quick escape if necessary. The knocking started again around 9 o'clock. Different locations this time. 3 measured knocks at the back door. Then, 5 minutes later, 3 more at a ground floor window, then the front door. It was systematically testing every possible entry point, patient and methodical, waiting after each set of knocks as if expecting me to respond, to invite it inside. I didn't make a sound, didn't move from my corner, barely breathed. The pattern continued for over an hour. Knock, wait, move to the next location, repeat. Then came a new sound, scratching at the front door. Slow, exploratory scratching like fingernails dragging across wood, searching for a weakness in the barrier. I pulled a blanket over my head and squeezed my eyes shut, every childhood instinct telling me that if I couldn't see the monster couldn't see me. The scratching eventually stopped, replaced by that heavy, waiting silence. I sat like that until dawn, muscles cramped and aching, barely maintaining my grip on consciousness. When morning finally came, I didn't waste time. I threw my essentials into my backpack and headed for my car, keeping my keys in hand, scanning constantly for any sign of the thing that had stalked me through the night. On the welcome mat, arranged with obvious care, were 3 objects: a smooth river stone, a bundle of dried herbs, and what looked like a small carved figure made from bone or antler. A gift, or a warning, or a claim of ownership. I stepped around them carefully and drove away without looking back. When Mary and Ron returned, I told them I'd had a family emergency and apologized for leaving early. They were kind and understanding, though Mary mentioned, almost casually, that they'd had trouble keeping caretakers in the past. People often leave earlier than planned, she said with a small, sad smile, usually without much explanation. The way she said it made me think they understood far more than they were willing to acknowledge. I never went back to Braxton County, and I never took another caretaking position, no matter how attractive the offer. Because I learned something important in that lodge. Some properties don't need caretakers. They have their own ways of taking care of things. At 27, I was offered a forestry tech position in a place called Ravenshade, a remote area so far off the beaten path that most GPS systems gave up halfway there, and you had to navigate by printed maps and landmarks mentioned in cryptic local directions. The job paid modestly, but came with free housing, a weathered trailer parked in a clearing about 10 miles from the nearest paved road. My official title was Firewatch Technician, though that was somewhat misleading considering it was December and the fire risk was virtually non-existent. What they really needed was someone to monitor trail conditions, collect footage from mounted cameras scattered throughout the forest, and keep an eye on tree health, looking for disease, damage, signs of invasive species. Boring work mostly, but peaceful. And the isolation was exactly what I needed after years of cramped city living and stressful jobs. The trailer was basic but functional: a narrow bed, a propane stove, a space heater that coughed and wheezed but eventually produced heat, and a small desk where I could review footage and complete reports. No running water. I had to haul it from a spring about a quarter-mile away, and no electricity beyond what a small generator could provide for a few hours each day. But I didn't mind. The simplicity was appealing. No distractions, no noise, no demands beyond the basic tasks outlined in my contract. Most days followed a simple pattern. Wake at dawn, make coffee on the propane stove, hike out to check cameras and trails, return to review footage, eat a simple dinner, Read by lamplight. Sleep. It was meditative, restorative. For the first 2 weeks, I felt more centered and calm than I had in years. Then I reviewed the footage from the North Loop camera. It was routine work, copying memory cards, scrolling through hours of static forest scenes, looking for anything noteworthy, fallen trees blocking trails, wildlife patterns, the occasional lost hiker. Most of it was mind-numbingly boring. Trees, shadows, more trees, the occasional deer or turkey passing through the frame. Then about 40 minutes into reviewing one card, something caught my attention. A figure in a red jacket, standing at the edge of the frame, not walking through, not moving, just standing there, completely still, facing the camera. I paused the footage, leaned closer to the small laptop screen. The image quality wasn't great. These were basic trail cameras, not professional security equipment, but the figure was definitely there. Broad shoulders, arms close to the body, head slightly tilted as if listening or watching. I checked the timestamp. 4:47 p.m. I'd been at that exact camera location just 20 minutes later, swapping out the memory card. I hadn't seen anyone, hadn't heard anyone, and there had been no footprints in the snow except my own. I rewound the footage, watched it again from several minutes before the figure appeared. They didn't walk into frame. One moment the frame showed empty forest. The next moment they were just there, as if they'd materialized out of thin air. I watched the next several minutes of footage. The figure didn't move, didn't shift position, just stood there, motionless, for exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds. Then, between one frame and the next, they were gone. No walking away. No movement. Just there. Then not there. A technical glitch, I told myself. These cameras malfunction sometimes, especially in cold weather. Probably a compression error or corrupted data causing a weird visual artifact. But it looked so real, so solid. I logged it as a possible equipment malfunction and continued reviewing the rest of the footage. Nothing else unusual appeared. That night, lying in the narrow bed with wind rattling the trailer walls, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, the way it had just appeared, the way it had stood so perfectly still, the red jacket that seemed too bright, too vivid for the muted forest colors. I eventually fell asleep telling myself it was nothing, just bad camera software. Nothing to worry about. I woke to find the trailer door standing open. Not wide open, just a few inches. Enough that cold air was flowing in, enough that snow had blown across the threshold and created a thin white line on the floor. I sat up quickly, heart suddenly pounding. I knew I'd latched that door, knew it with absolute certainty. The latch was stiff and required deliberate effort to close properly. I got up slowly, scanning the small interior of the trailer for any signs that something had been disturbed. Everything looked normal at first. My gear was where I'd left it. My food supplies were untouched. Nothing seemed to be missing. Then I noticed the boots. There were 2 pairs sitting by the door, my worn hiking boots, and a second pair I'd never seen before. These were smaller, newer, almost pristine, and completely dry despite the snow outside. I picked one up, examined it. There was a tag still inside, with text in what looked like French. My mouth went dry. I checked the trail log I was required to maintain, a simple notebook where I documented any hikers or visitors to the area. The last entry was from 2 weeks ago. No one else was supposed to be up here. I should have radioed base immediately, should have reported the intrusion. Instead, I stood there, holding that strange boot, trying to rationalize its presence. Maybe someone had dropped off supplies and didn't log it. Maybe there was a visiting researcher I hadn't been informed about. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost and left their boots accidentally. None of those explanations made sense, but they were better than the alternative my mind was offering, that something had been inside my trailer while I slept, close enough to touch me, and had left those boots as proof of its visit. I put the boots outside, closed and latched the door firmly, and tried to go about my normal routine. But everything felt wrong now. The forest, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt watchful. The silence, which had been calming, now felt oppressive. That night, around 9 o'clock, I heard it. A low, rhythmic thudding sound. Not loud, but persistent, like something heavy being set down gently, over and over, just outside the trailer. I turned off all the lights and sat in darkness, listening. The sound continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped abruptly. I waited another 10 minutes before daring to look outside. I pulled the curtain back just an inch and peered out into the darkness. Nothing. Just snow and shadows, and the vague shapes of trees in the moonlight. When I finally opened the door the next morning, the boots were back inside the trailer, not by the door where I'd left them. On the small counter next to my sink, placed carefully side by side. That broke me. I packed my essentials, radioed base that I was coming down a day early due to equipment failure, and left within the hour. I didn't tell them about the boots, or the footage, or the sounds in the night. I just left. Sometimes I wonder if that figure in the red jacket is still standing at the edge of camera frames, perfectly still, waiting for the next person who's naive enough to think they're alone in those woods. I wonder, but I'll never go back to find out. So there you have it. 10 deeply unsettling stories from people who thought they were alone in the woods until something proved them terribly, horrifyingly wrong. These accounts come from different regions, different years, different people. But they all share common threads. The isolation, the footprints that shouldn't exist, the sounds that defy explanation, the sense of being watched by something that operates by rules we don't understand. I want to emphasize that these stories come from reliable sources, ordinary people with no reason to fabricate experiences that would make them seem unstable or attention-seeking. Many of them have never told their full stories publicly before, sharing them only with close family or friends who might understand. What do we make of these experiences? Are they encounters with something genuinely unknown, creatures or entities that inhabit the deep wilderness beyond human understanding? Are they psychological phenomena, the result of isolation and fear manifesting in consistent patterns? Or is there something about certain places, certain pieces of land, that actively resists human presence? I don't have answers. I just have the stories and the pattern they create when placed together. What I do know is this. The wilderness is vast, and we've barely scratched the surface of understanding it. We like to think we've mapped every corner, documented every species, explained every phenomenon. But there are still places where our maps grow vague, where our explanations falter, where something older and stranger persists. If you've had similar experiences, if you've been alone in the woods and encountered something you can't explain, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments. You're not alone in this, even though you might have been alone when it happened. And if you're planning a solo trip into the wilderness, please take precautions. Tell people where you're going. Bring more supplies than you think you need. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, don't rationalize it away. Get out. Because sometimes the scariest thing about being alone in the woods isn't the solitude. It's discovering you were never alone at all. Thank you for listening. Stay safe out there. And remember, if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. It genuinely helps me continue bringing you these stories. Until next time, this is Mr. Skeleton, reminding you that some silences are louder than screams.